The day Caroline Crawford was traded for 12 head of cattle at the Haskell County line, the sky was the color of a bruise, and the man who made the trade had already decided he would undo it before the sun went down. Her name was Caroline Crawford, and she was 22 years old, and she had not been asked a single thing about any of it. It had started 3 weeks before the trade, when her father, Elias Crawford, had drunk his way through what remained of the family's savings at the saloon in Abilene, Kansas. The year was 1874, and Abilene had been a cattle town for years, the kind of place where fortunes were made and lost between a sunrise and a sunset, and Elias Crawford had always been better at the losing than the making. He owed money to a man named Silas Rudd, who ran a cattle operation out of the flatlands south of Dodge City, and Silas Rudd was not the kind of man who forgot a debt or forgave one either. Caroline had been keeping the household together since her mother, Martha Crawford, died of fever 3 years prior. She had been cooking and mending and stretching every dollar until it screamed, and she had done it without complaint because that was the only way she knew how to survive. She had believed, in the naive and hopeful way that young women in difficult circumstances sometimes allow themselves to believe, that things would turn eventually, that her father would find steadiness, that some grace would settle over their small, weathered house on the edge of town. Instead, Elias Crawford had shaken hands with Silas Rudd over a bottle of whiskey and sealed an arrangement that made Caroline's blood run cold when she heard it. Silas Rudd needed a woman for his ranch. His previous housekeeper had run off with a traveling merchant, and Rudd's household was, by all accounts, a disaster of unwashed dishes and muddy floors and no decent cooking. He was 47 years old, red-faced and thick-necked, and he had made it known that he wanted a woman who could cook and clean and otherwise make herself useful without too many opinions about the arrangement. Elias Crawford, deep in whiskey and deeper in debt, had agreed to send his daughter. In exchange, Rudd would forgive the debt and hand over 12 head of good cattle to Elias Crawford, cattle that could rebuild the Crawford operation if Elias had the sense to use them properly. It was, by the standards of the frontier in 1874, a transaction that was not entirely without precedent, and that fact alone made it more terrible, not less, because it meant the world had long agreed that such things could happen. Caroline had stood very still when her father told her. She had stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the flat Kansas land, the prairie grass bending in the afternoon wind, and she had not cried because she was too angry and too shocked to cry, and she had not argued because she had learned long ago that arguing with Elias Crawford after he had made up his mind was like arguing with the weather. She packed one bag: a change of dress, her mother's small Bible with the water-stained cover, a comb, and a photograph of Martha Crawford taken by a traveling photographer the year before she died. She packed these things with the care and deliberateness of someone who had decided that if the world was going to treat her like something that could be bartered, she would at least carry herself like something of worth. The exchange was arranged for the Haskell County line, a stretch of flat road where the two county jurisdictions met, marked only by a weathered post driven into the hard earth. Silas Rudd arrived with 2 of his ranch hands and 12 fine cattle, broad-backed and healthy, their hides catching the pale morning light. Elias Crawford arrived with Caroline in the wagon, and he did not look at her much during the ride, and she did not speak to him, and the silence between them was the kind that cannot be repaired. Chester Winslow had not intended to be at the Haskell County line that morning. He was 28 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent more time outdoors than in, with dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red Kansas stone as the earth beneath his boots. He had been riding south along the county road on his horse, a gray roan named Pepper, heading toward Dodge City on an errand for the Harmon Ranch, where he had worked the past 4 years as a trail hand and sometime foreman. The errand was a letter that needed delivering to a land agent. the kind of errand that got handed to the man the rancher trusted most, which was Chester Winslow. He came around the bend in the road and saw the two wagons and the cattle and the group of men, and he slowed Pepper without thinking about it, because something in the arrangement of it all did not sit right with him. He had seen enough of the frontier to read a situation before he was fully inside it. He saw the cattle. He saw Silas Rudd, whom he knew by reputation as a man who operated just inside the law and sometimes just outside it, depending on what was convenient. He saw Elias Crawford, whom he did not know, and he saw Caroline. She was standing beside the Crawford wagon with her small bag held in both hands in front of her, and she was not crying, and she was not looking at any of the men, and she was not looking at the cattle, and she was looking instead at the flat horizon, as though she was calculating the exact distance to some invisible place where none of this was happening. She wore a blue dress that was clean but faded from many washings, and her dark brown hair was pinned up under her bonnet, and she was the most utterly still person Chester Winslow had ever seen in his life. Still, the way a trapped animal sometimes goes still, not because it has given up, but because it is waiting. He brought Pepper to a halt at a distance and watched the exchange for a moment. He heard Rudd saying something about the cattle, confirming the count, and he heard Elias Crawford making noises of agreement. He watched one of Rudd's hands take hold of the bridle of the first cattle beast. He watched Rudd step toward Caroline, and he watched Caroline take one very small step backward, and he watched that step, and something in him tightened like a wire pulled too far. Chester Winslow was not a man who involved himself in other people's business as a rule. The frontier did not reward nosiness, and he had learned early that a man who stepped into every dispute he witnessed would not last long. But there was a line he had drawn for himself, somewhere deep and quiet where his convictions lived, and that line had something to do with the dignity of people who had not been given a say in their own circumstances. He rode Pepper forward. Silas Rudd looked up when the horse approached, and his expression was not welcoming. His two ranch hands straightened, the way men do when they sense that something is about to complicate their morning. Chester touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, Rudd." Rudd squinted at him. "Winslow, what brings you out this way?" "Errand for Harmon, just passing through." Chester let his eyes move over the scene with the slow casualness of a man who is pretending he is not doing exactly what he is doing. "That a fair price you are getting for those cattle?" Rudd's eyes narrowed. "Fair enough for both parties." Chester looked at Caroline then, directly and without apology, and she looked back at him, and her eyes were brown and very clear and very steady, and he saw in them not fear exactly, but something close to it wearing the mask of composure. "What is your name, ma'am?" Chester asked. She blinked. No one had asked her anything in a very long time. "Caroline Crawford." "Miss Crawford," Chester said, "are you here of your own choosing?" The silence that followed that question was considerable. Elias Crawford made a sound. Silas Rudd's face darkened. "That is none of your concern, Winslow," Rudd said. "I expect you are right about that, generally speaking," Chester said, keeping his voice even. "I am asking the lady." Caroline looked at him for a long moment. Her chin came up slightly. "No," she said, "I am not." The word landed in the road between all of them like a stone dropped in still water. Silas Rudd took a step forward. "Now see here, this is a legal transaction agreed upon by—" "I know what it is," Chester said. He swung down from Pepper in a single easy motion and stood with the reins loose in his hand. He looked at Elias Crawford, who had the grace to look at the ground. "And I know what it is not." He stood there for a moment, looking at the cattle, counting them in his head. 12 good animals. He thought of the money in his saddlebag, the wages he had saved, the money he had been setting aside for 2 years for the purpose of eventually acquiring his own piece of land. It was not a small sum, and it was not the same as 12 head of cattle, but the calculation he was making had nothing to do with money in the ordinary sense. "I will buy the cattle from you, Rudd," Chester said. Rudd stared at him. "What?" "Name your price for the 12 head. "I will pay it if it is reasonable and the deal between you and Crawford is undone. The lady stays where she chooses to stay. Elias Crawford's head came up at that. The debt. The debt is between you and Rudd, Chester said, looking at Crawford with eyes that held no particular warmth. That is your burden to manage, and I am sorry it has come to what it has, but I will not stand here and watch this. What followed was an argument of the kind that men have when pride and money and calculation are all tangled together. Silas Rudd was angry because he felt the arrangement was being interfered with, and he said so plainly. Chester listened to him say so and did not move from where he was standing, and there was something in his stillness that made Rudd's anger gradually exhaust itself, the way fire does when it runs out of fuel. The negotiation took half an hour, and in the end Chester Winslow paid Silas Rudd for the 12 cattle. It was most of what he had. He paid it without flinching, and the cattle became his, and he then turned to Elias Crawford and made it plain that the debt between Crawford and Rudd was Rudd's problem to renegotiate, not his. Rudd was displeased but not, ultimately, foolish enough to make a physical confrontation of it. He had his money, and the frontier had taught him, as it had taught most people, to take a certain kind of win when it presented itself. Then Chester turned to the cattle, all 12 of them. He looked at them for a moment with the eye of a man who genuinely appreciated a good animal. They were fine cattle, no question, but there was only one thing to do with them, and he had known it before he'd even counted his money. He turned to Elias Crawford. "These are yours," he said, "the 12 head." Crawford blinked. "I do not understand." "They are being handed back to you," Chester said. "No condition, no debt. You take them, and you do right by your daughter, Mr. Crawford, or I will have a great deal more to say about the matter the next time I pass through." It was not yet midday, but Chester Winslow had handed back the cattle, as he had decided he would, before the sun moved very far toward the west at all. Caroline Crawford stood beside the wagon and watched all of it with the expression of a person who has been waiting her whole life for something to happen and is not entirely sure how to respond now that it has. Chester walked over to her. He held out his hand not in a proprietary way, but the way a person offers steadiness when the ground has been unsteady. "Where would you like to go, Miss Crawford?" he asked. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the road ahead, stretching south, golden in the morning light. "Away," she said. "Anywhere that is away." "I am headed toward Dodge City on an errand," Chester said. "I expect there is a decent boarding house there, and I know the woman who runs it. She is a fair person. You would be safe and welcome." Caroline picked up her bag, which she had set down at some point during the negotiation without noticing. She looked at her father, who was standing by the wagon with his hat in his hands, and the look she gave him was not hatred, which surprised her, but something more complicated and more sorrowful, which did not surprise her at all. She did not speak to Elias Crawford. She turned and accepted Chester Winslow's hand and let him help her up onto Pepper. Chester swung up behind her, and she was very careful to hold herself straight, not touching him more than was necessary, because she had decided she was not going to be passed from one man's keeping to another's, even if the second man had shown every sign of being a decent human being. She was going to be in her own keeping, and she was going to hold that truth even on horseback on the Kansas plain. They rode south together, and the morning spread out around them, and neither of them spoke for a long while, and the silence was an entirely different kind than the one she had shared with her father in the wagon. This silence had room in it. Eventually, Chester said, "Are you all right?" "I am angry," Caroline said. "That is reasonable," Chester said. "I am angry at my father, and I am angry at that man Rudd, and I am angry at the whole arrangement of things that makes it possible for a woman to be," she started again, "for a person to be exchanged like a piece of property." "You have every right to that anger," Chester said. "And I am aware," she continued, with a precision that told him she had been thinking about this very carefully while it was happening, "that you acted with generosity back there, and I am grateful for it, and I am also clear that I do not owe you anything on account of it." Chester was quiet for a moment, "No," he said, "you do not." She turned her head slightly to look at him over her shoulder, which was awkward on horseback, but she managed it. "You believe that?" "I do," he said. "I did not do it to put you in debt to me. I did it because it was wrong what was happening back there and I could do something about it." She turned back to face forward. "Most men would not have." "I know," Chester said. "That does not make me heroic, it makes most men short of decency." She thought about that. "What is your name?" "Chester Winslow. I work for the Harmon Ranch about 40 miles north of Dodge." "What will you do now?" she asked. "You spent your money." "I have a job," he said. "I will earn more." "The cattle you handed back," she said. "Those could have been the start of something for you. Land, maybe, a herd." "Yes," Chester said. "Why?" she asked. "Why hand them back? You could have kept them." Chester was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, and then he said, "Because a man who gets his start that way has to live with it. That is not the start I want." Dodge City in 1874 was a town in the process of becoming a legend, though most of the people who lived there were too busy surviving it to notice. The Santa Fe Railroad had come through, and the cattle drives from Texas were pouring up the Kisham Trail, and the streets were full of cowboys and merchants and gamblers and people with very specific intentions. The lawkeeping was improving, but only gradually, and the town had the energy of a place that was not yet sure what it was going to grow up to be. Chester rode them into town in the early afternoon and took Caroline directly to a boarding house on the east side of Front Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Hazel Dobbins, who was a stout and formidable woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner and a genuinely warm heart that she kept carefully hidden under a layer of practical brusqueness. Mrs. Dobbins took one look at Caroline Crawford and the way the girl was holding herself, and she knew, with the particular knowledge of women who have seen a great deal, that something difficult had happened recently. She did not ask about it. She showed Caroline to a small clean room with a window that looked out over the street, and she said that supper was at 6 and breakfast was at 7. And she said that if anyone bothered Caroline in her establishment, that person would find themselves rapidly on the far side of Mrs. Dobbins' very solid front door. Caroline thanked her with a sincerity that made Mrs. Dobbins' expression soften momentarily before it reassembled itself into its customary practical lines. Chester delivered his letter to the land agent and arranged for lodging for himself at the stable where he kept Pepper, which was an economy he was accustomed to in tight times. He returned to Mrs. Dobbins' boarding house that evening for supper, because Mrs. Dobbins also took in paying dinner guests, and because he was, if he was honest with himself, not ready to simply ride north and leave Caroline Crawford in a strange city without at least checking that she was settled. Supper at Mrs. Dobbins was a long table with 8 or 10 people around it, and there was roast beef and bread and some very good stewed tomatoes, and the conversation was the kind of ordinary frontier conversation about cattle prices and weather and the roads and who had passed through town recently. Caroline sat at the table and listened more than she spoke, and Chester watched her listening and thought that she was taking in a great deal more than she appeared to be. After supper, they sat on Mrs. Dobbins' front porch while the town went about its noisy evening business, and the air smelled of dust and horses and something cooking somewhere. "What will you do?" Chester asked her. She had been thinking about this since they left the county line, working through it with the systematic determination of a person who has learned that no one else is going to work it through for them. "I can cook," she said. "I can sew. I can keep accounts because my mother taught me figures and my father in his better years taught me to read. I imagine there is some kind of work in a town like this for a woman who can do those things." "There is," Chester said. "Mrs. Dobbins herself might know of something. She knows everyone." "I will ask her," Caroline said. She looked out at the street. A group of trail riders passed, laughing about something. "I do not intend to be a burden to anyone." "I did not think you did," Chester said. She looked at him then, in the yellow light coming from the window behind them, and he was looking back at her, and there was a quality to the moment that made them both aware, simultaneously, that they were sitting in comfortable proximity to each other, and that this was, given the events of the morning, a remarkably unlikely and somehow right place to be. "You are a strange kind of cowboy," she said. "How do you mean?" "Most men I have known would not have done what you did this morning. Even the ones who are decent, generally. It costs something to step into a situation like that." "It cost me some savings," Chester said, and there was a dry humor in his voice that surprised a small laugh out of her, and the sound of it surprised both of them. "I mean beyond money," she said, recovering. "You involved yourself, made an enemy of Rudd, probably." Chester shrugged. "Rudd got paid, he will survive the insult. And I have learned that the things that cost you most tend to be the ones worth paying." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with a directness that he was already coming to understand was simply how she talked, "I do not know what to make of you, Chester Winslow." "You have time to figure it out," he said. "There is no rush on it." He rode back to Harmon Ranch the following morning, and Caroline Crawford began what would be several weeks of building a life in Dodge City. She spoke to Mrs. Dobbins, who proved to be exactly the resource Chester had suggested. Within 2 days, Caroline had a position helping at the dry goods store owned by a family named Pierce, where she kept the accounts and assisted with inventory and sometimes served behind the counter. The Pierces were a husband and wife operation, both of them Kansas-born and sensible, and they paid Caroline a fair wage and did not ask her difficult questions. She found that she liked the work. She liked the order of the accounts, the clean precision of numbers that added up correctly. She liked the store itself, with its smell of flour and lamp oil and new cloth, and she liked talking to the people who came in, the farm wives doing their seasonal shopping and the ranch hands buying supplies and the occasional traveler passing through. Dodge City was a place where stories walked in off the street on a daily basis, and Caroline Crawford, who had grown up in a quiet, unhappy house in Abilene, found herself drinking it all in with a thirst she had not known she had. She thought about Chester Winslow more than she expected to. She thought about him in a way that was careful and deliberate, the way she thought about most things, turning the facts over and examining them. He had done an extraordinary thing on her behalf. He had not asked for anything in return. He had spoken to her like a person whose opinions and wishes were relevant. He had made her laugh, which was not a small thing on a day like that day. She wrote him a letter. It took her 3 drafts to get it right, because she was not sure of the tone she wanted, and she did not want to write as though she was offering him anything beyond what was written, and she also did not want to be stiff and ungrateful. She finally settled on something that was honest and warm and did not pretend to be more or less than it was. She told him she was settled. She told him the position at the Pierce store was going well. She thanked him again, and she said that if he was ever passing through Dodge City on Harmon Ranch business, she hoped he would stop in. She gave the letter to Mrs. Dobbins to include with the outgoing mail, and then she went to work, and she told herself that was the end of it, practically speaking, and she half believed herself. Chester Winslow received the letter at the Harmon Ranch and read it twice standing in the yard with the midday sun on his back, and then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and went back to work. He thought about writing back and spent 3 evenings not quite doing it, and on the 4th evening he sat down at the bunkhouse table after the other men had gone to sleep and wrote her a letter that was, as letters from Chester Winslow went, longer than he usually wrote, because he found he had more to say to her than he usually found himself having to say to anyone. He told her about the Harmon Ranch, which was a large and well-run cattle operation with a herd that had wintered well. He told her about a coyote that had been causing trouble with the horses and the elaborate and ultimately unsuccessful attempts to discourage it. He told her about the country between the ranch and Dodge, which he had ridden back and forth many times, and which had a particular quality in the late afternoon light that he had never quite managed to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including his own. He said nothing about what he felt when he thought about her. That would have been premature, and it would have been dishonest in a way, because he was not yet sure what he felt, only that it was there and that it was not nothing. She wrote back within the week. He wrote back to that. The letters continued every week or so through the autumn of 1874, and they were the best letters of both their lives, not because they were eloquent in any formal sense, but because they were honest. She told him about the town, about the people she was meeting, about a woman named Ruth Chastain who had become a friend, who ran a small millinery shop 2 blocks from the Pierce store, and who was the most opinionated and entertaining person Caroline had ever met. She told him about things she was reading, because Mrs. Dobbins had an excellent small library, and about things she was thinking about the world. He told her about his past in those letters, gradually, the way a person reveals something when they have decided to trust. He was from Missouri, originally, from a family that had broken apart in the aftermath of the war, the way many families did in the years following 1865. His father had died at Shiloh when Chester was 18. His mother had later died of grief, which was not listed as a cause on any official document, but was what he believed had taken her. He had drifted west after that, done a variety of things, and found that the open land and the cattle work suited something in him, some need for space and honest labor and a world that rewarded what you actually did rather than what your name implied. Caroline read those letters in her small room at Mrs. Dobbins, by lamplight, and she understood something that she had not quite articulated before, which was that Chester Winslow was a man who had survived a great deal of loss by the act of remaining himself. That was not a small thing. He came to Dodge City in October on legitimate Harmon Ranch business, and she met him at the Pierce store. He came through the door and the little bell above it rang, and she looked up from the account ledger, and something in her chest did a very unaccountable thing that she chose not to examine too closely. He looked the same as she remembered, which was to say that he looked like the person who had ridden into the worst morning of her life and changed its direction, and she had been half afraid that memory had made him more impressive than he was, and she discovered that it had not. "Miss Crawford," he said, with the careful formality they had maintained, though the letters had made it rather thin. "Mr. Winslow," she said, "you look like you have been riding in dust." 40 miles of it, he agreed. She came around the counter, and Mrs. Pierce, who had heard a great deal about Chester Winslow without being told explicitly anything, found a reason to be in the back room. They walked out to the street and stood in the October afternoon, and the town moved around them, and they talked the way people talk when they have been corresponding for months, and suddenly find themselves in the same physical space, which is to say they talked the way people who have already crossed most of the distance talk to each other. Easily, with recognition. He stayed 3 days in Dodge City, completing his business with a land agent regarding a parcel the Harmon Ranch was considering purchasing. In the evenings, he had supper at Mrs. Dobbins' table, and afterward he and Caroline sat on the porch, and their conversations went long into the evening, ranging across everything from the practical to the philosophical in the way that conversations do when two people are genuinely interested in each other's minds. On the last evening he said, with characteristic directness, "I would like to come back and see you again, if that is something you are willing for." She thought about it with the honesty that she brought to everything. "Yes," she said. "I am willing for that." "Good," he said. "Chester," she said, using his given name for the first time out loud, which they both noticed, "I want to be clear that I am still working out what I am on my own terms, after this year, after everything." "I know," he said. "I am not in a hurry," she said. "Neither am I," he said. She looked at him. "Most men would be." "I am not most men," he said simply and without vanity. She believed him, which was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about that evening. He came back in November, and again in December, and by December the porch conversations had moved inside because it was too cold for the porch, and they sat in Mrs. Dobbins' parlor with a fire going and the rest of the house quiet around them, and the warmth of the room and the warmth of the conversation had become the same thing in a way that was hard to separate. On one of those December evenings, he took her hand. He did not make a production of it. He simply reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that for a while, talking, and the simplicity of it was more intimate than anything more deliberate could have been. She told him about her mother, Martha Crawford, in a way she had never told anyone. About the Sunday afternoons when Martha would read to her, about the way her mother had taught her to bake bread with a patience that Elias Crawford never had for anything, about the photograph she carried in her bag. She got out the photograph and showed it to Chester, and he looked at it for a long time, at the face of a woman he could see Caroline in, and he said, "She looks like someone who understood things." She did, Caroline said. She understood a great deal more than she was ever given credit for. "That seems to run in the family," Chester said. She looked at him, and what she felt was something that had been building for months, visible now in the firelight, clear and certain. She had spent so long in her life not being seen by anyone that to be seen so plainly by this particular man was an experience she had no ready framework for, and she decided in that moment to stop trying to build a framework and simply be inside the experience. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am falling in love with you." Chester looked at her. His eyes were very dark and very steady in the firelight. "I am quite certain I am already in love with you," he said. They sat with that for a moment, the fire crackling, the December wind pressing at the windows outside. "I did not plan for this," she said. "Neither did I," he said, "but I find I am not sorry about it." "Nor am I," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, briefly and gently, with the kind of tenderness that is all the more powerful for being restrained, and she felt it go all the way through her. And she thought about how strange and improbable the path had been to reach this particular warm room on a December evening in Dodge City, Kansas, and how she would not have chosen any of those steps and would not now undo a single one of them. Winter settled over Dodge City, and the town quieted somewhat, as it always did when the cattle drive stopped, though it never truly quieted because there were people there year-round who needed feeding and supplying, and who had disputes that did not take a winter holiday. Caroline worked steadily at the Pierce store. She had become, over the months, genuinely indispensable there, and Mr. and Mrs. Pierce treated her with the consideration that people extend to someone they have come to rely upon. Her friendship with Ruth Chastain deepened, and they were often to be found together in the evenings, either at Ruth's shop or at Mrs. Dobbins' parlor, talking with the free and ranging ease of women who have established a genuine bond. Ruth Chastain was 30 years old, originally from Ohio, with auburn hair and a quick wit that she deployed like a sharp instrument against every form of pretension she encountered, which in Dodge City meant she was very busy. She had come west 5 years ago with a husband who had died of typhoid within 18 months, and she had decided, with a clarity that impressed Caroline, that she would build something for herself rather than waiting to be placed in the context of another person's life. Her millinery shop was doing well, the women of Dodge and the surrounding ranches being willing to ride considerable distances for a hat that was both fashionable and sensible. Ruth knew about Chester Winslow in considerable detail, because Caroline had told her, and Ruth had opinions. "He sounds entirely too good to be true," Ruth said one afternoon, pinning a hat brim with efficient precision. "In my experience, men who present as entirely too good to be true are usually either deceiving you or deceiving themselves." "He is not deceiving either of us," Caroline said. "I would know by now." "What makes you so certain?" "Because I have been watching very carefully for 6 months, Caroline said, "and nothing has contradicted itself. He is exactly what he appears to be." Ruth stopped pinning. "That is genuinely remarkable," she said, "like finding a genuine sapphire in a bucket of glass." "I know," Caroline said. "Well," Ruth said, returning to the pin, "you had better not let him wander off then." Chester came in January, and he had something to say that he had been building toward for a while, and he had rehearsed it not in the sense of scripting it, but in the sense of being clear with himself about what he meant and why. He took her for a walk along the riverbank on a cold, clear afternoon, and they wore their heavy coats and watched the Arkansas River move dark and quick below its edges of ice, and he said, "I have been thinking about the future." "What kind of thinking?" she asked. "The kind where I am trying to work out what I want it to look like," he said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "The Harmon Ranch has offered me a permanent foreman position. The pay is better and it comes with a house, a small one on the ranch property." "That sounds like a good thing," she said. "It is a good thing," he said. "But I have been thinking that a house is an interesting thing to have if you are alone in it, and whether I want to be a man who is alone in his house." She looked at him. The river moved past. The wind was cold on her cheeks. "Chester, I am asking if you would consider marrying me, Caroline," he said. "Not because you owe me anything which you do not, and not because I want to rescue you from anything which you have already done yourself, but because I want to be in the same life as you. Because those letters were the best part of my year. Because your laugh was the first thing I thought about when I woke up this morning, and the last thing I thought about last night. Because I would very much like to be the person who has the right to take your hand in front of other people, and to sit across a table from you every morning, and to build something with you." She had known or suspected that this was coming, and she had been thinking about it herself, turning it over and over, asking herself the hard questions that a woman who had been bartered for cattle at a county line and had come out the other side with her dignity intact has every right to ask herself before she agrees to any permanent arrangement with any man, however good he appeared to be. The answers had kept coming back the same way. "Yes," she said. "Chester, yes." He smiled, which transformed his face in a way she had not quite seen before, the careful steadiness of him breaking open into something younger and unguarded, and she thought that she was going to spend a very long time learning the variations of that smile, and that this was a prospect she found entirely appealing. He took her hands in both of his, and they stood by the icy river in the January cold, and neither of them minded the temperature at all. They were married in February of 1875, in Dodge City, at the small Methodist church on 2nd Street. The ceremony was performed by a minister named Reverend Alcott, who had a tendency toward lengthy sermons but managed, on this occasion, to restrain himself to something appropriate for a wedding. Mrs. Dobbins was there, wearing her good dress and her best impassive expression that fooled no one. Ruth Chastain stood as Caroline's witness and cried, which she would afterward vehemently deny. Several of the Harmon Ranch hands attended for Chester's side, men he had worked beside for years, and they cleaned up surprisingly well and behaved themselves with only minor exceptions. Caroline wore a dress she and Ruth had made together over the previous month, a deep cream color with small buttons down the front, and she wore her mother's small pearl brooch at the collar, because it was the closest she could get to having Martha Crawford in the room, and she felt, standing at the front of that little church, both the weight of what was missing and the extraordinary fullness of what was present, and she held both things in her chest without letting them cancel each other out. Chester stood at the front of the church and watched her come up the aisle, and his expression was the expression of a man for whom the world has suddenly organized itself into the shape it was always supposed to have had. When Reverend Alcott asked if he took this woman, Chester said yes with an emphasis that made the word sound like a complete and well-considered sentence. When the Reverend asked if she took this man, Caroline said yes with a precision that had behind it 6 months of careful watching and the conviction of a person who knows her own mind. They were married. The congregation, small as it was, made a considerable noise of approval. The house on the Harmon Ranch was indeed small, a 4-room affair with a kitchen and a sitting room and 2 bedrooms, and a porch that faced east so that you could see the sunrise if you were up early enough, which on a working cattle ranch you generally were. It had been empty for 2 years and had a few repairs needed, which Chester made over the weeks before the wedding, and by the time Caroline arrived it was not grand, but it was sound and clean, and it had possibilities. Caroline looked at those possibilities with the eye of someone who had grown up in a house that had been neglected and had learned from watching it what a home needed. She knew what spaces needed warmth and what surfaces needed care, and how a place could be made to feel lived in rather than merely occupied. She brought her small bag with her mother's Bible and the photograph and the comb, and she added to these, gradually, the things that made the house into something else. She made curtains for the kitchen window out of blue cloth she bought at the Pierce store before she left. She planted a small kitchen garden in the spring, even though the growing season was short and uncertain, and the Kansas soil in that particular spot had opinions about what it was willing to produce, and she negotiated with the soil through the medium of compost and water and stubborn determination, and eventually came to a kind of agreement with it. She wrote letters to Mrs. Dobbins and to Ruth Chastain, and Ruth wrote back at length, and with the full deployment of her considerable wit, and these letters were a consistent delight. She missed Ruth with an ache that surprised her, but the ache was manageable because she understood it as the price of having something worth missing, which was not nothing. The Harmon Ranch in 1875 was a busy operation. Richard Harmon was the owner, a man of 60 with a white beard and a direct manner who had built the ranch from a modest beginning 20 years ago into something significant. He respected Chester, as men who know cattle and land respect the person who manages their cattle and land well, which is to say deeply and practically. He welcomed Caroline with a gruff courtesy that she found she liked very much. Chester's days started before sunrise and often ended after dark, and there were stretches of time during branding and trail work when Caroline barely saw him except across the supper table, and she had expected this, and had prepared herself for it because she was a practical person who believed in honest accounting of what a life actually contained rather than what one wished it contained. But what she had not quite expected was how much she liked the life anyway. She discovered, without having planned it, that she had a talent for the bookkeeping side of the ranch operation. Mrs. Harmon, a quiet and intelligent woman named Alina who had been managing the ranch's accounts with considerable competence for years, was glad to have a second mind, and she and Caroline spent several mornings a week at the Harmon house going over ledgers and correspondence and the intricate mathematics of running a large cattle operation. It was not the Pierce store, but the principles were the same, and the scale was actually more interesting, and Caroline found herself genuinely engaged. She was also, as the months passed, becoming known in the community of ranch families and small homesteaders that spread out across the land around Harmon's operation. People came and people passed through, and she was the kind of woman who made people feel that the time they had spent in her company was time that mattered. She had opinions and she shared them, which was not always expected of a woman in 1875, but she shared them with enough fairness and enough genuine interest in what the other person thought that people generally received it well. She thought sometimes about her father. The anger had not entirely gone, and she did not think it would or should, because what had happened at the Haskell County line was something that should remain angry, both for her own sake and for the principle of the thing. But she had also come to understand, in the way that people sometimes do when enough time and distance have settled on a difficult thing, that her father was a man who had been broken by something long before he had broken her trust, and that understanding this did not excuse him but did make him human rather than simply monstrous. She would not seek him out, but she would not carry him as a weight either. The summer of 1875 was hot and dry, the way Kansas summers could be, and the ranch hands worked in a kind of endurance mode, managing the herd through the heat and the limited water and the constant vigilance that cattle required. Chester came home each evening with dust on him that had settled into the lines of his face, and Caroline had supper waiting and sometimes a cool cloth for his face and neck, and these were small things, but they were not small. One evening in August he sat at the kitchen table while she was washing up, and he said, "I have been thinking about something." "What?" she said, not turning from the wash basin. What would you think about land of our own? She turned then. What do you mean? I have been saving again, he said. Not as fast as before, but steadily. Harmon pays well. And I have been thinking that the foreman job is good and I am grateful for it, but that what I want eventually is something that is ours. Not land we manage for someone else. Land we own. She dried her hands on the towel and sat down across from him at the table. Land where? There is a parcel about 12 miles east, he said. Good grass. A creek runs through it. Not a big parcel, but enough to start something. She thought about it. She thought about the creek running through it and the 12 miles from Harmon's ranch and what it would mean to build something from the ground rather than from inside someone else's structure. How much? She asked. He told her, and they went over the numbers together at the kitchen table, which was one of the ways they had found, without planning it, to be married, the working together of figures and possibilities with the same seriousness and the same trust. We could do it in 2 years, she said, if the ranch accounts go as they have been, and if I keep the bookwork for a leaner Harmon. My thought exactly, he said. She looked at him across the table. This man who had ridden into her worst morning with enough decency to change everything, who had chosen her and gone on choosing her every day in the plain and steady way that was more romantic to her than any grand gesture could have been. Then let us do it in 2 years, she said. The news that Caroline was expecting came in the autumn of 1875, and it arrived in the way such news does on a working ranch, quietly and privately first, and then increasingly impossible to keep quiet as the winter progressed. She told Chester one morning when she had been sure enough to be sure, and he had sat very still for a moment with an expression on his face that was the closest she had ever seen him come to being overwhelmed. And then he had crossed the kitchen and taken her face in his hands and pressed his lips to her forehead with a tenderness that left her no question about how he felt about this. Are you well? He asked, pulling back to look at her. I am extremely well, she said. I am also somewhat terrified. Me too, he said. She appreciated that. She would have known if he was pretending not to be, and she was glad he was not. Mrs. Dobbins came from Dodge City in January to check on her, because that was the kind of person Mrs. Dobbins was, for all her gruff practicality. And she stayed a week and assessed the house and the kitchen and the arrangements, and gave a series of very specific pieces of advice about various aspects of the coming months that were practical and sensible, and delivered with a no-nonsense warmth that Caroline found deeply comforting. Mrs. Dobbins also assessed Chester Winslow with the thoroughness of a woman who had been watching men for decades, and arrived at the conclusion that he was acceptable, which from Mrs. Dobbins was high praise. Ruth Chastain wrote a letter that was 6 pages long and absolutely characteristic of her, full of opinions and warm underneath every single one of them, and Caroline read it 3 times and laughed in all the right places. The baby came in April of 1876, on an afternoon when the Kansas spring was doing its unpredictable best, warm sunshine with cold edges, and the first wildflowers were appearing in the grass around the ranch. The birth was attended by Mrs. Eleanor Harmon, who had brought 3 of her own children into the world on this very frontier and was calm and capable throughout, and by a traveling doctor who happened to be at the ranch on an unrelated matter and was recruited for the occasion with considerable efficiency. The baby was a boy. Chester held him with the careful reverence of a man who has just understood something about the world that he had not understood before, and the look on his face was something Caroline catalogued carefully and kept. They named him James, after no one in particular and both of them in general, because they had both come from such disrupted origins that naming the child after a family member felt more complicated than simply giving him a name that was clean and new and his own. James Winslow was a healthy and opinionated infant from the beginning, with dark eyes like his father and a forehead wrinkle of concentration like his mother, when he was working something out, which was often, and the house that had been small and quiet expanded around him into something considerably livelier. The spring of 1876 was also the time that Elias Crawford arrived in the Harmon Ranch area, which Caroline had not expected, and which required of her a steadiness she had to consciously locate. She heard from Chester, who had been in Dodge City and heard it there, that Elias Crawford had ridden down from Abilene, that he was asking after his daughter. She sat with this information for a long time before she did anything with it. She talked about it with Chester that evening, and he listened without telling her what to do or what to feel, which was one of the things she had come to understand was a specific and important gift he gave her. "He has a right to want to know how I am," she said finally. "I am his daughter, that is biological fact." "Yes," Chester said. "He does not have a right to anything else," she said. "Not forgiveness, not a place in our life, not an easy absolution." "No," Chester said, "he does not. But I think," she said carefully, "that I want to see him. One time, not for him, for me. Because I need to say certain things and I am tired of carrying them around unsaid." "Then we will arrange it," Chester said, "and I will be right there." Elias Crawford came to the house on a Tuesday morning, and he looked older and smaller than Caroline remembered, which was always the way with parents who have disappointed their children badly, the stature that shame shrinks them to. He stood in the yard and held his hat and looked at his daughter, and his eyes moved to the baby on her hip, and something in his face broke open and then very carefully reconstituted itself. Caroline stood in her own doorway on her own land, holding her son, and looked at her father with clear eyes. She told him what she needed to say. She said it without cruelty and without softness either, because neither was appropriate. She told him that what he had done had been a profound betrayal, not merely of her trust, but of the most basic responsibility a parent has toward a child. She told him that she had built something from the wreckage of it, and that she was not building it for his benefit or with his participation. She told him that she hoped he had done something useful with the cattle that Chester had handed back to him, and if he had any self-respect left, he would have. He had. She found out later that he had, in fact, used the cattle to restart a modest operation outside Abilene, and that he had stopped drinking, or mostly stopped, and that he was not what she would call a reformed man, but was perhaps a man who had been scared into some version of better behavior. She did not invite him inside. She did not introduce him to Chester beyond a brief acknowledgement. She did not say she forgave him because she was not there yet, and she was not going to say things she did not mean. But she did, at the end of the conversation, look at him directly and say, "I am well, Father. I am very well. I am better than I have ever been." She said it not as comfort to him, but as a statement of fact about herself, and the fact of it was what mattered. He left. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, and Chester came and stood behind her and put his hand on her shoulder, and James babbled something against her collarbone, and she felt the shape of her life around her, solid and real and chosen. By the autumn of 1877, the Winslow savings had reached what they needed, and Chester sat down with Richard Harmon and had the conversation that he had been preparing himself for, explaining that he intended to purchase the parcel 12 miles east and start his own operation. Harmon received this with the equanimity of a man who has known it was coming and has made his peace with it. He offered Chester a fair severance and a handshake, and a standing offer of advice when needed, which Chester accepted with genuine gratitude. The parcel 12 miles east was purchased in November of 1877, and the winter was spent planning and preparing. Chester built the house himself, with help from 2 of the Harmon hands who came on their days off, because that was the kind of friendship that the frontier built between men who worked hard together. Caroline helped, more than Chester initially thought was advisable, but she pointed out with perfect reasonableness that she had opinions about the house she was going to live in, and that it was more efficient to implement them during construction than to work around them afterward. Chester acknowledged the logic of this. The house had a larger kitchen than the one at the Harmon Ranch, because Caroline had very specific ideas about kitchens. It had a porch that faced both east and west, which Chester had designed after consulting her on the matter, because she had said she wanted to see both the sunrise and the sunset from their own property, and he had decided that this was a reasonable thing to want, and that it was within his ability to make happen. Ruth Chastain came to visit in the spring of 1878, when the house was finished and the Winslow operation was beginning to take shape, and she walked through every room with the discerning eye of a woman who had decorated a shop from scratch and knew what she was looking at. She approved in terms that were characteristically Ruth, which meant that she found specific things to critique, and then acknowledged that overall the effect was excellent, and that Caroline had clearly managed Chester Winslow's building tendencies to good effect. Chester found Ruth Chastain extremely entertaining and told Caroline so in those exact words, and Caroline said that was the correct response to Ruth and that most people arrived at it eventually. The first cattle on the Winslow land were a modest herd, purchased carefully, and Chester brought to their management the same steady and knowledgeable attention he had brought to everything else in his life, which meant that the herd was healthy and the operation grew, not dramatically but consistently, in the way that things grow when they are properly tended. James Winslow, now 2 years old, showed an alarming interest in the cattle and an alarming fearlessness around them that required considerable supervision and produced considerable gray hairs in both his parents. He was a robust and cheerful child with his father's steady temperament and his mother's habit of looking at everything very carefully before deciding what to do about it, and these combined qualities made him, on the whole, a manageable and delightful person to have around. The summer of 1878 brought an unexpected visitor in the form of a young man named Samuel Pierce, the son of Mr. and Mrs. Pierce of the Dodge City Dry Goods Store, who had been traveling through the area on his own errand and stopped to say hello to Mrs. Winslow, whom he had known from the store. He was 19, a forthright and energetic young man, and he mentioned in passing that his parents were thinking of retiring from the store and did not yet know what they would do with it. Caroline mentioned this to Chester that evening with the particular careful tone that Chester had learned to recognize as meaning she was thinking something she had not quite finished thinking yet. "You want to buy the store," Chester said. She blinked. "How did you know that?" "Because you love accounts and you love people and you love the idea of running something," Chester said. "And the Pierce store is a good operation in a growing town. And you have mentioned it at least 4 times since we have been married in various contexts, always in the tone of someone calculating whether something is possible." She stared at him. "Have I?" "You have," he said with the quiet smile that she knew meant he was enjoying this. "I do not want to the ranch needs." She stopped, reorganized. "We could not do both at the same time financially." "Not immediately," he said, "but give it another year or 2 years and we might be at a point where we could." And in the meantime, writing to the Pierces to express interest costs nothing. She wrote to the Pierces. The Pierces wrote back. Over the course of 1878 and 1879, a set of conversations occurred, the kind of careful and unhurried conversations that serious business arrangements require, and by the end of 1879 an agreement had been made. The Pierces would retire to live with their daughter in Topeka, and the dry goods store would become Winslow's Dry Goods, managed by Caroline, with a hired hand to work the floor and keep the stock organized. Caroline Winslow went back to Dodge City 2 days a week to run the store. She rode the distance on a steady mare named Clara, and the routine of it suited her in every dimension. She was good at it, as the Pierces had always known, and as the people of Dodge City quickly reconfirmed, and the store prospered under her management with a speed that surprised no one who knew her and surprised her just a little, which she found gratifying. Chester managed the ranch, which was now large enough to require one full-time hand besides himself, a man named Danny Briggs, who was 23 and exceedingly capable, and who became genuinely fond of the Winslow family in the way that a certain kind of good-natured and hardworking young man becomes attached to the people who treat him fairly and set him a reasonable example. Little James went to the store with his mother sometimes on the 2-day rides, perched in front of her on Clara, and he showed early an interest in the business of it, or at least in the counting of things, which Mrs. Dobbins, who was now a fixture of their visits to Dodge City, declared was a promising sign. Mrs. Dobbins remained as she had always been, formidable and warm underneath it, a constant in Caroline's life that was both comforting and anchoring. She came to the ranch for Christmas in 1879, which required some logistical arrangement given her age and her stated opposition to sleeping anywhere that was not her own very specific bed. But it was managed, and she sat at the Winslow Christmas table and ate Christmas dinner and made pointed comments about the turkey that were entirely accurate and that everyone found amusing. And she played with James with a gruff tenderness that the child found utterly normal and charming, because he had known no other version of Mrs. Dobbins. The news of the second baby came in the spring of 1880. Caroline told Chester in the kitchen again, as she had with James, and he responded with the same stillness and then the same movement toward her, though this time there was also James, who was 4 years old, standing between them and looking at his parents with the baffled interest of a child who senses that something important is happening but cannot identify what. "Is everything all right?" James asked, with the very precise enunciation that was his habit, a reflection of Caroline's early and consistent reading to him. "Everything is very all right," Chester told him. "You are going to have a brother or a sister," Caroline told him. James considered this information with his characteristic wrinkle-forehead seriousness. "I think a brother," he said finally. "It is not quite that simple to decide," Caroline said. "Still," James said, with the confidence of a 4-year-old who is working from incomplete data but full conviction, "the second baby was a girl." She arrived in November of 1880 in the Winslow house that now felt properly, roundly full, and she was named Martha, because Caroline had been waiting for a long time to give her mother's name to someone who would be worthy of it, and looking at this daughter, dark-eyed and furious-faced as she was from the first moment, she felt with certainty that this was the right person. James Winslow's response to Martha Winslow was initially skeptical, then fascinated, then protective, in the order that elder siblings often move through those stages, and within a week he had appointed himself her guardian in all matters that he was capable of managing, which at 4 years old was limited but earnest. The year 1881 was eventful in the way that years on the frontier tend to be eventful, with weather and cattle prices and the general business of living requiring constant adaptation and response. Chester expanded the herd modestly but successfully. The store in Dodge City continued to perform well. Caroline had, by this point, taken on a young woman named Bessie Watts to help at the store on the days Caroline was at the ranch, and Bessie proved to be an excellent addition, reliable and quick-learning and possessed of a warmth with customers that reminded Caroline a little of herself at that age. Ruth Chastain had, in 1880, married a man named Calvin Morse, who was a doctor recently arrived in Dodge City and who was, by Ruth's somewhat surprised account, both her intellectual equal and her genuine affection, which she had not expected to find in the same person. Caroline had attended the wedding with Chester and James and the not-yet-born Martha, and had cried herself, and denied it afterward in a way that was entirely transparent to everyone present. Calvin and Ruth Morse came to the Winslow Ranch for a summer visit in 1881, and the 4 adults sat on the east porch in the evening while the children were put to bed, and they talked in the particular way that people talk who have known each other through significant things, with a depth that does not require constant explanation. Chester and Calvin, who had been strangers before this visit, discovered a mutual interest in the management of land and the keeping of animals, which doctors on the frontier were often also involved in. And the conversation between the four of them that evening was the kind that people remember afterward as one of the good evenings, the kind that seems to encapsulate something about what it means to be alive and among people you genuinely love. In 1882, Chester filed the formal deed for the Winslow land, the parcel 12 miles east of Harmon's, which had been operating under a purchase agreement for the prior years, while the paperwork moved through the land office with the deliberate pace that such things moved. The deed came back stamped and official, and Chester brought it home and laid it on the kitchen table, and Caroline looked at it for a long time. It read, as such documents read, in the language of ownership and boundary and legal claim, and it named the land and the land's owners, Chester Winslow and Caroline Winslow, and it was signed by a land agent in Dodge City and countersigned by the county recorder. She picked it up and held it in her hands, this document that meant something so specific and so large. "We own this," she said. "We do," Chester said. She looked at him. "Do you know what I thought about on that horse with you, riding away from the county line?" "What?" "Nothing," she said. "I thought about nothing. I could not think about anything because everything that was supposed to be stable in my world had just demonstrated that it was not stable at all. I was just trying to stay on the horse and breathe." She looked down at the deed. "I could not have imagined this, any of this." Chester sat down across the table from her. "And now?" She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that holds everything. The grief and the anger and the love and the work and the morning light through the kitchen window, and the sound of James and Martha arguing about something in the next room, and the feel of her mother's Bible on the nightstand, and the particular shade of red the Kansas sunset made over the property that was hers. "Now I cannot imagine not having it," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, in the way he had first reached for her hand in Mrs. Dobbin's parlor by the fire, and the gesture was the same and entirely different because it was now so deeply familiar, because it had been repeated in so many contexts and seasons, because it meant what it meant and had always meant it. "I love you," he said. It was not the first time he had said it, not by a great number of repetitions, but it was one of those times when it sounded most fully like what it was. "I know," she said. "I love you." In 1883, James Winslow started school at a small schoolhouse that had been established 2 years prior, about 4 miles from the ranch, the result of enough families in the area having enough children of school age to justify its existence. He rode there in the mornings with Danny Briggs, who passed that way on his own errands, and he came home each afternoon full of information about everything he had learned and opinions about the quality of the teaching, which were sometimes accurate. Martha Winslow, at 2.5, was forming opinions of her own, with a speed and firmness that Chester said was purely her mother's doing, and that Caroline said was purely Chester's stubbornness wearing a smaller and more aggressive hat. She was not particularly interested in dolls or in the domestic small play that was generally assigned to girls her age. She was interested in the cattle. She was interested in the horses. She was interested in everything that moved and made noise and existed outdoors in the Kansas weather. And Caroline had decided early that she was not going to discourage this, because a girl who knew her own interests was a girl who would not be easily lost. Danny Briggs had, by 1883, become sufficiently established in his own right that he was beginning to think about his own land, and Chester had several conversations with him about how to go about it that were some of the most practical and generous conversations Chester had, because he understood that helping a good young person get started on something honest was simply a good use of whatever knowledge a person had managed to accumulate. The summer of 1883 was the summer that the question of what had happened at the Haskell County line came up in a way that Caroline had not anticipated. Mrs. Dobbins, now quite elderly and less mobile than she had been, came for a visit, and on one of the quiet afternoons when the children were occupied and Chester was out with the herd, She and Caroline sat on the east porch with coffee, and Mrs. Dobbins said with the directness that had always been her characteristic mode, "Do you ever think about what happened when you were young? At the county line?" Caroline considered this question for a moment. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "Does it still hurt?" "It is more like a scar than a wound," Caroline said. "It is present, it does not bleed." Mrs. Dobbins nodded. "What you built after it is remarkable." "Chester helped," Caroline said. "He did," Mrs. Dobbins said. "But I want you to hear something, Caroline, because I am old and I say things now without worrying too much about whether they are the right time. What you built is yours. Chester is a good man, and I have never said differently. But the person who decided to stay on that horse and breathe on the worst morning of her life, and to ask to go somewhere that was away, and to take a position at the Pierce store and learn the town and let herself be loved when she was ready to be loved, that person is you. I want you to know that I know that." Caroline looked at her for a moment, this woman who had given her a clean room with a window and a seat at a supper table, who had said that anyone who bothered her in the establishment would be removed from it. "Thank you, Hazel," she said. It was the first time she had called her by her given name, and Mrs. Dobbins received it with a small nod that was, for her, quite emotional. In 1884, Richard Harmon died. He died peacefully, which was a grace, and Alina Harmon continued the ranch with the help of a capable manager, and the Winslows attended the funeral and Chester stood by Alina at the graveside, and they were connected in the way that people who have worked toward a shared good are connected, even when the formal work is finished. That autumn, Caroline's Winslow's dry goods expanded. She added a second room to the store and brought in a broader range of goods, responding to Dodge City's continued growth and the increasing sophistication of what the people in the area wanted and needed. The expansion was Chester's idea, originally, or at least the financial backing for it was, and it was Caroline's execution entirely, which was the pattern that had developed between them over the years, one of them seeing a possibility and the other bringing the practical structure to reach it, and the directionality of this was not always the same and did not need to be. James Winslow, at 8 years old, was becoming a reader of consequence. He had worked his way through everything in Mrs. Dobbins' library on their visits to Dodge City, and was beginning to make requests of the bookseller, who occasionally passed through the area. Chester bought him a copy of Robinson Crusoe in the spring of 1884 and watched James disappear into it for the better part of a week, with the satisfied expression of a man who recognizes something of himself in a child. Martha Winslow at 4 was riding the smallest and steadiest horse on the property with an assurance that made Danny Briggs, who had been the one to first put her up on the horse, simultaneously proud and slightly anxious, and was showing early signs of the particular combination of boldness and calculation that Caroline recognized as the inheritance of her own approach to everything. In the late autumn of 1884, Elias Crawford died. Caroline received the news through a letter from a lawyer in Abilene, which stated that he had died of natural causes and that there was a modest estate, and that she was named in the will. She sat with the letter for a long time. What she felt was complicated, which she had expected, and it included grief, which she had not entirely expected, the grief not for what her father had been but for what he might have been and was not, and for the mother who had loved him before all the breaking. She was not devastated, she was not relieved. She was, she decided, sorrowful in a measured way, and that was an honest way to be. She told Chester. He listened and held her hand and did not try to tell her what to feel or how much of it to feel, which was exactly right. She went to Abilene to see to the estate. Chester came with her, and they left James and Martha with Alina Harmon, who was glad of the purpose. Abilene in 1884 was somewhat tamer than it had been in its peak cattle years, the trade having shifted to other towns as the railroad moved south, and the streets were quieter and the atmosphere more settled. She saw to the legal matters with an efficiency that the lawyer found impressive. The estate was modest but not nothing, and she arranged for the proceeds to go to the Methodist church in Abilene that her mother had attended, because it seemed to her the right home for money that had come from a complicated source. She walked past the old Crawford house, which was now occupied by a different family, and she stood on the street and looked at it for a moment. Chester stood beside her. "I am all right," she said before he could ask. "I know," he said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him briefly, and then they walked on. The ride back was long, and they rode through the November landscape, the prairie in its autumn colors of brown and gold and gray. And the sky was very large above them the way it always was on the Kansas plain. And she thought about the distance between the girl who had stood at that county line with her bag in her hands, and the woman riding through this landscape with everything she had built beside her. And the distance was not merely a matter of years, but of all the decisions and all the mornings and all the choices that accumulate into a life. She was 32 years old. She was healthy and purposeful and loved by a man who saw her completely. And she had 2 children who were growing into themselves with the particular certainty of people who have been given a stable ground to grow from. And she had a store and a house and a deed with her name on it, and a friend named Ruth Chastain who wrote her letters that made her laugh out loud, and who she could see every week when she went to town. And she had the memory of her mother's voice and the solidity of her mother's Bible on the nightstand. And she had all of this because of a series of events that had started with the worst morning of her life. She thought about that sometimes, the unpredictable paths of things, and she did not draw any easy lessons from it, because she was too honest for easy lessons. What had happened at the county line was wrong and had been wrong and would always have been wrong, and it was also true that what came after it was extraordinary. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she had made peace with holding them both. She reached over and touched Chester's arm where it held Pepper's reins, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and no words were necessary for what passed between them, because it was only the accumulated evidence of everything they had been to each other and everything they were going to continue to be. In the spring of 1885, there was a 3rd baby. This one arrived in June, with the prairie in full flower around the Winslow house, and the birth went easily, as the 3rd sometimes does, and the child was another boy, which James received with a proprietary satisfaction that he managed to keep mostly dignified. They named him Thomas, after no particular relative either, continuing their habit of giving their children names that were clean and new and theirs. Thomas Winslow from the first days showed a temperament that was sunny and untroubled in a way that was its own particular gift, as though he had looked over the inheritance of both his parents' complicated histories and decided to specialize in contentment as a kind of balancing act. He laughed easily and slept well and regarded the world with a friendliness that made every person who held him feel briefly that the world was perhaps not so difficult as they had been finding it. Martha Winslow, at 4½, treated her new brother with the tolerant magnanimity of someone who has already secured her position in the family hierarchy and can afford to be generous. James, at 9, was genuinely tender with the infant in a way that was one of the most quietly moving things Chester and Caroline observed that year, because it told them something about who their eldest child was becoming. The summer of 1885 was a good summer. The cattle were healthy and the store was profitable, and the house on the Winslow land rang with the ordinary, extraordinary noise of children and a working life, and 2 people who had chosen each other with full information, and continued daily to make that choice. Chester and Caroline had developed a practice, sometime in the early years of their marriage, of sitting together in the evenings after the children were in bed, on the porch that faced west in the summer months, and simply being in the same space without any particular agenda. The conversation that happened in these times ranged everywhere and nowhere, and the silences between the conversation were comfortable, and this was perhaps the most telling measure of the quality of what existed between them, that the silences were as nourishing as the words. On one of those summer evenings in 1885, Chester said, looking out at the darkening sky, "I think I am the luckiest man I know." Caroline looked at him. "That is a large claim." "I know," he said. "I stand by it." She thought about arguing it. In the good-natured way, she sometimes argued things with him just for the pleasure of hearing him think on his feet, and then she decided against it. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am the luckiest woman I know." Chester looked at her with the slow smile that she had been cataloging for 10 years. "We are well matched in that, then." "We are well matched in a great many things," she said. He reached over and found her hand in the evening dark, and she turned her hand to hold his, and they sat on their own porch on their own land in the Kansas summer evening, with their children asleep inside, and the stars coming out above the flat horizon. And the story of how they had come to be there was complicated and full of injustice and full of grace in equal measure, and neither of them forgot either part of it, and both of them were grateful every day for where it had led. The years after 1885 settled into the good and productive rhythm of a life properly made. The Winslow operation grew steadily, becoming known in the area for quality cattle and honest dealing. Caroline's store became a fixture of Dodge City commercial life, and she expanded it again in 1887, adding a small post office counter that the town badly needed, and that brought in a reliable additional income. Bessie Watts, her hire, had become over the years something closer to a partner, and Caroline had given her an increasing stake in the operation that reflected the reality of what Bessie contributed. James Winslow, at 12, was the most serious reader in the county and had developed, with his parents' encouragement and the resources of the store's book section that Caroline had established, a relationship with literature that would shape everything that came after. He announced, with the particular gravity of a 12-year-old who has made a significant decision, that he intended to become a lawyer, and neither Chester nor Caroline laughed at this or dismissed it, because they could see that it was not the impractical dream of a distracted child, but the considered intention of someone who had been thinking about it for a while. Martha Winslow, at 7, could ride better than most of the adult hands on the neighboring ranches, and had opinions about cattle that were more specific and more accurate than those of several men twice her age. Chester taught her everything he knew about the herd with the same seriousness he had brought to James's education in reading, because he believed that a person's interests were their interests regardless of which child they inhabited, and that the right thing to do with them was to teach, not redirect. Thomas Winslow, at 2, continued his career as the most contented person in the household, a role he filled with what appeared to be genuine ease and without any sign that he intended to stop. In 1888, Ruth Chastain Morse had a baby of her own, a daughter, and Ruth's letter announcing this was 6 pages long and entirely characteristic, including a passage about how she had never intended to become a person with a baby, and yet here she was, and the baby appeared to have inherited Calvin's logical mind and her own aesthetic sensibility, which Ruth found both terrifying and deeply correct. Caroline and Chester took the children to Dodge City for a visit, and Caroline held Ruth's daughter and felt the familiar weight and warmth of an infant in her arms, and the particular emotion that belongs to holding someone else's baby when you have your own, which is a combination of tenderness and recognition, and a quiet fullness. "She is beautiful, Ruth," Caroline said. "She is the most alarming thing I have ever encountered," Ruth said, with a fondness so transparent it made Calvin Morse smile from across the room. The years continued. The land continued. Chester Winslow rode his property in the early mornings and in the late evenings and found it, every time, the right size and shape for what he had wanted, for what he had paid for, and handed back and ultimately built on the honest foundation of work and love. Caroline Winslow ran her store and her house and her life with the same clear-eyed competence that had kept her upright on the worst morning and every morning since, and she found that the competence had not diminished anything that was soft in her, but had instead built around it something strong enough to keep it safe. By 1890, James was 14 and reading law books borrowed from Calvin Morse's limited library, with an intensity that suggested his announced intention had not been a phase. Martha was 10 and had become so much a part of the operations of the Winslow ranch that Chester had begun to let her make certain decisions about the herd that he would normally make himself, not because he was shirking the responsibility, but because he wanted her to understand that the knowledge was hers to use and not merely to observe. Thomas was 5 and starting school, showing early signs of mathematical aptitude that made Caroline suspect he might be the one who ended up in the store with its accounts and its inventory. The Winslow house was full and loud and warm, and on the winter evenings when the Kansas wind pressed against the windows, the fire in the sitting room held them all, Chester and Caroline side by side on the settee that had been their first large furniture purchase for the house. The children arranged variously across the room in the postures of children who are engaged and content, and the lamp light making everything amber and close, and outside the wide flat country under the winter stars, and the cattle settling in the shelter of the barn, and the mare Clara in her stall, and all of it theirs. Caroline thought, on those evenings, about the word away. She had said it on that road at the county line, in response to the question of where she wanted to go, anywhere that is away. She had meant it as an escape, a direction defined by negation, by what she was leaving rather than by any destination. She had not known, saying it, that she was giving herself permission to arrive somewhere. Chester Winslow, on those same evenings, thought sometimes about the bend in the road before the county line, about what would have happened if his errand had taken him a different route that morning, and the thought lasted about as long as it took the fire to make a particular sound, and then he returned to the present, which was the only place he needed to be. He would look at Caroline in the lamplight, the same woman and so many years of woman, the person who had stood at the worst morning of her life with a bag in her hands and her chin tilted up and her eyes on the horizon, and he would feel what he had always felt from that first look, from her clear, steady eyes at the county line, from the day she had said yes in a way that sounded like a well-considered sentence. He loved her. He loved her with the full and undiminished love of a man who has had the privilege of learning someone completely over the long course of a life, who has seen them in their anger and their grief and their joy and their stubbornness and their generosity and their strength, and found all of it, every variation and every season of it, to be more than enough. She would look at him on those evenings, and she would know what he was thinking, in the way that people who have shared a life long enough know these things, and she would take his hand, and they would sit in the warmth of everything they had made together. The Haskell County line was 12 years behind them. The deed with both their names on it was in the drawer. The children were growing, the cattle were healthy, the store was prospering, the land was theirs. And outside, the Kansas night stretched wide and dark and enormous, full of stars, exactly the same stars that had been there the morning a cowboy had ridden around a bend in the road and decided that some things were simply not acceptable, that some mornings could be changed, that the cost of a good thing was worth paying, and that handing back what you had done right was as important as doing it in the first place. The stars made no judgments about any of it. They only shone, steady and indifferent, over a house where a lamp was burning warm in the window, over a woman who had said away and found home, over a man who had made a trade and unmade it and built something better in its place, over 3 children sleeping in the rooms above, over a stretch of Kansas land that was documented and owned and planted with a kitchen garden and crossed in the mornings by a woman on a mare named Clara, and in the evenings by a man on a gray roan named Pepper. Over all of it, this life, this particular chosen life, burning bright and complete and thoroughly, happily, irreversibly its own.